Okay, so to this point, in chapter 10, we've discussed variances are related to direct materials, being the price variance and the usage variance, all right? And then also direct labor, being the rate variance and the efficiency variance, all right? So that's two of the three buckets in product cost. So now we're going to shift and talk about overhead. All right. Now, overhead's a little different in that direct materials and direct labor, for our purposes, are variable cost. Okay. Well, overhead has its fixed and variable components. All right. And so it's important to understand that we have actually four variances: a spending variance and an efficiency variance for variable overhead, and then a spending variance and a volume variance for fixed overhead. All right. Now, they're still very formula based. Let's take a look at the handout. So I posted a handout. You see it on the screen, but it's also available for you to download. This is Chapter 10, Handout 2. All right. And so it gives you the following information. The following standard costs were developed for one of the products of Maldi Company. Variable overhead at standard 5 hours, that's per unit, $4 per hour. Fixed overhead 5 hours, also $15 per hour. All right. So it is worth noting that all the problems that you'll see in this chapter assume that overhead is applied on the basis of direct labor hours. All right. Now you guys know from earlier units that that's not always the case. Sometimes it's machine hours, sometimes it's something else. But for the purposes of this chapter, overhead is applied on the basis of direct labor hours. Okay? All right. And then these are the standards. So this is your budgetary information. All of this information would have been established before you were in that period. And we have some actual numbers. 20,000 units produced during the period, 115,000 direct labor hours worked during the period. And then you have your actual variable overhead, $437,500, and your fixed, $1.32 million. All right. Then the problem goes on to tell us budgeted fixed overhead for the period, $1.35 million. And the standard fixed overhead rate was based on expected capacity of 90,000 direct labor hours. Okay, so let's start in with requirement A. Calculate the variable overhead spending variance and indicate whether it is favorable or unfavorable. All right, so we're going to look for our formula. That's this one here. All right. And it's presented in two ways. The way this particular problem is set up, let's use this first iteration. Actual overhead times actual variable overhead rate minus actual hours. And I think I said that wrong, so let's say that again. Actual hours times actual variable overhead rate minus actual hours times standard variable overhead rate. All right. All right. Now, for this particular problem, we can, for this chunk, the actual hours times actual variable overhead rate, Well, that's given. The product of that is given. So that's just your 437.5. So we don't really need to back that out. We've got that in total. So we can start with that number. All right. And we're going to subtract actual hours, which is given 115,000 direct labor hours. And your standard rate is also given. We see it for variable is $4 per hour. All right. We get 22,500. Shows as negative. And if we follow this formula, if we follow the formula, we know that negative numbers equate to favorable variances. All right. So this means that variable overhead will be better than standard. All right. So that's what that means. We'll move on to part B. Calculate the variable overhead efficiency variance and indicate whether it is favorable or unfavorable. All right. Okay. So let's compute the well, let's pick out the formula that we'll need. And so efficiency actual hours times standard variable overhead rate minus standard hours times standard variable overhead rate. All right. Or we can just do actual hours minus standard hours times the standard variable overhead rate. All right. So let's take the latter iteration for this particular problem. So actual hours minus standard hours times the standard variable overhead rate. All right. So for us, actual hours, given information, minus, all right. Now we need to figure standard hours, all right. So your standard 20,000 times the $4. I'm sorry, the $4 per hour. All right. And actually, I picked the wrong. It's the 5 hours per unit. So the 20,000 units times the 5 hours. All right. Which gives us the number of hours that should have been incurred under the standard. All right. All right, 60,000, and shows as positive, which is indicative of an unfavorable variance. All right. Let's press on. And those are your variable overhead variances, your variable overhead spending variance, and your variable overhead efficiency variance. Typically, if we were asked to do this in one problem where we computed direct labor, direct materials, you would also that your well, you would find that your variable overhead spending variances would parallel the direct labor rate and efficiency variances. In most cases, that's going to be the same. So these are going to parallel. In other words, if you had a favorable overhead rate variance, then you're most likely also going to have a favorable overhead spending variance. All right. Anyway, pressing on. Calculate the fixed overhead spending variance on part C and whether it is favorable or unfavorable. All right. So fixed overhead spending variance is actual fixed overhead less budgeted fixed overhead. All right. Fixed overhead spending variance, actual fixed overhead less budgeted fixed overhead. All right, this is perhaps a bit more straightforward than the variable. Your actual 1.32 million less budgeted 1.35 million. All right, and so we have a negative number, all right, which equates to a favorable variance. All right, so $30,000 favorable. You spent $30,000 less than the budget indicated. All right, D. Calculate the fixed overhead volume variance and indicate whether it is favorable or unfavorable. All right, back to the formula sheet. Budgeted fixed overhead minus applied fixed overhead. All right. So budgeted fixed overhead is still the 1.35. Actually, let me, for consistency, budgeted fixed overhead less applied overhead. So you may remember applied overhead from previous chapter. That's the estimation of overhead based on direct labor. All right. 1.35 million less. All right. So we need to figure applied overhead. All right. Well, 20,000 units were produced. All right. And then we look at these components. 5 hours per unit at $15 per hour. All right. Okay, and keep in mind when we apply overhead, we are using the actual activity, either 20,000 units times the budgetary standards. All right, and so we'll solve that. All right. and we get 15. Check that. 150,000 favorable. All right, so it looks like the company made out like rock stars as it relates to fixed overhead. Spent considerably less. Okay, so that's a quick fly through of the variable overhead spending variance, variable overhead efficiency variance, fixed overhead spending variance, and fixed overhead volume variances.